Hey folks, so I'm here to go over some of my games from yesterday's big event in San Francisco. For those that weren't following, this is the 2019 Pro Chess League Rapid Championship. Actually, I'm not 100% sure what the official title of the tournament was, but since the Pro Chess League finals are this weekend in San Francisco, they decided to hold this big rapid event at the Mechanics Chess Club, a very historic chess club. And the event was super cool. They got a great turnout. Fabiano Caruana showed up and played. Sam Shanklin was there. A bunch of other GMs. So it was a really strong rapid event that took place actually just last night. I'm recording this the day after. So my tournament was all right. I had some interesting games, and of course, the highlight for me was in round 2 having to face Fabiano Caruana. That was really awesome, and we'll definitely get to that game. But in round 1, I was playing actually one of the younger players in the event, Adrian Kondakov, who I know since he's a local student at Bay Area Chess. And so he was playing white. He played e4. I decided to play knight to c6. This has been my pet line recently, both in rapid and when I'm trying to play for a win against lower rated players, so it kind of worked out here. And he goes for d4, d6. Eventually we end up getting this kind of a perk hybrid, and he develops pretty normally with bishop e2, castles, h3. But this is kind of the moment where he loses the advantage. Since black plays knight c6, this is kind of a provocative move. I'm really provoking him to play d5 and grab some space. And in order to fight for the advantage, I think white does have to do that here. Black's idea is typically to just drop back with the knight, then eventually develop the knight through d7 and try to use the c5 or e5 squares, maybe play c6 and get some counterplay against the d5 pawn. So I think that's how white has to play if they want to fight for the advantage. Of course, they can develop more aggressively as well. But here after h3, black gets to play e5, and this is kind of an equalizer. Now at this point, white should play d takes e5, and then black probably plays knight takes e5, although you could take with the pawn as well. And I think that position is about equal. But instead, white played bishop e3, which I think is actually a little bit inaccurate. And I realized here, after e takes d4, knight takes d4, and rook e8, that it's not so convenient for white to defend this e4 pawn. Since white has already played h3, they don't really want to play f3. This would just leave the dark squares too weakening. Like f3, knight h5, for example, is already really dangerous for white with bishop e5 and queen h4 coming, and then some sacrifices. And if white goes like bishop f3 or bishop d3, then they have to contend with a potential knight e5, which can be an annoying move. So white ends up taking on c6, b takes c6, and bishop d3. And in this position, I really felt comfortable because it was basically kind of transposing into a King's Indian structure, which I feel like I'm pretty familiar with at this point. And I actually didn't realize this until just this morning, but all 5 of my games in this tournament, in one way or another, ended up with King's Indian structure. So I think only 2 of them actually featured the King's Indian in the opening, and the rest of them just ended up getting there through transposition. So for King's Indian fans, this is going to be quite a series of interesting positions. Okay, so here I started with knight to d7. I think d5 was also interesting. But I came up with this plan to try and improve the knight, queen d2, rook b8, just putting a little bit of pressure, rook to b1. The time control, by the way, for this tournament was game in 15 plus 2-second increment, which is like the official time control for the Pro Chess League as well. And so it was pretty fast. I mean, not quite a blitz game, but definitely still feels like you really don't have a lot of time for the game. Okay, here I went with knight e5, which seemingly leaves the a7 pawn kind of hanging, but I did have a trick up my sleeve here. White should not have taken this pawn. He should have just played a calm move like bishop e2, and then try to prepare f4, and then I think white is, definitely doing all right. In fact, instead of knight e5, knight c5 might have been a better square for the knight. during the game I wasn't sure if I can allow this pawn structure, but I think having the dark squares really compensates for it. And black can play like bishop e6 and c4, and I think it gets a lot of play here. But anyway, after knight e5, he grabbed on a7. I played rook a8, bishop went back to e3, and bishop takes h3 was my trick now that the knight's on e5 and hitting the f3 square. Now white basically, I think, has to play f4. This is kind of the only move, and thankfully I can take on d3 and exchange off this knight before retreating the bishop. Now I really felt like he should have taken on h3 and just leave my knight on d3 and force me to retreat from here. Because my knight probably has to go to b4, maybe a3, knight a6, and yeah, I think black is already better here because white's structure is weak, but I mean the position is far from clear, and you know I have to figure out how I'm going to get my knight back into the game. But instead he took back on d3, allowing me to keep the bishop, and here I felt like black should be really comfortable. I think the two bishops are good. I have a lot of targets, and I think importantly this c6 pawn is really restricting the knight, so the knight doesn't feel like it has such a great square to go to. Okay, so white played a3, I played queen h4. Just kind of a pseudo-active move, you know, it's rapid, so just trying to put my pieces on good squares and not overthink things too much. Rook c1, rook b8, he pushed b4, and then I played f5. And I thought this was a useful move. I'm putting a little bit of pressure on the e4 pawn, and he's constantly going to have to think about defending this one. So he went queen f2, which I was definitely happy to see because I already felt that this endgame would be quite good for me. And in fact, I could play bishop d7 here or do what I did in the game, which is take on e4 and play bishop d7, and white is already losing a pawn because if I want to, I can take on c3 at any moment and take on e4. I don't think I actually have to take on c3 so quickly. I can build up with some pressure, like maybe rook a8 first. But in general, white's position is kind of collapsing here. And had he taken knight e4, it's kind of the same thing. Black just goes bishop d7. White's pieces have no targets, but I'm threatening d5, and all of white's pieces are kind of hanging here. So yeah, this endgame just ended up being really good for black. After bishop d7, white played e5. I took rook d2, bishop f5. And then he totally blundered here with knight a4. I mean, the position is not dead lost yet. I mean, black is definitely better here with extra pawn and two bishops. But after something like fe5, bishop e5, and knight e2, black would still have a lot of work to do to convert this one. Knight a4, though, just runs into rook a8, and a3 is hanging, and then once I take on a3, the bishop on e3 is hanging, so everything in white's position just kind of falls. So he tried to make the most of it, but I just had too much pressure here. Bishop h6, g3, rook takes e3, and yeah, I think these tactics are not too hard to find when all of white's pieces are kind of lined up on the dark squares. This kind of stuff is quite natural. So I end up winning a couple pawns here. He has to defend the rook on d2. I win back the exchange, and he's going to take the g3 pawn, but black will be left with these two connected passers on the king side. And I didn't have too much trouble converting this one. In fact, I felt like it was quite clean, and I was happy about that. So I started with this move g5, just restricting white's king, stopping any king f4, and preparing rook e3 check. He went knight a6. I defended the pawn, knight b8. Now I realized, you know, I can give up one of these pawns as long as I just get my g-pawn going, so I played rook e3 check, rook c3, knight a6. Now I can no longer defend the c7 pawn, but I realized that my g-pawn is just rolling here, so g4 takes g3, and the bishop is coming to e4, and everything is kind of coordinated very well, like the rook, bishop, and pawn. So bishop e4, threatening mate. White played rook d1, then I played rook c2, just activating the rook and threatening rook h2, and it was basically over. He gave one check, knight f4, rook h2, rook f2, and it was over. So I felt quite happy about this game. I thought it was definitely a decent start. Like, kind of controlled the action. I found a couple nice tricks, and yeah, clean win, I would say. So in my next game, of course, I was surprised to find out I was paired with the world #2 player, Fabiano Caruana. It was absolutely a dream come true. I mean, as soon as I heard that he had signed up for the tournament, I really wanted to play him because you don't get these chances very often. And yeah, the game was quite interesting. Unfortunately, I kind of spoiled it with one move later on, as we'll see. But I still feel like I could get a lot out of it. Okay, so I played d4, knight f6, c4, and d6. So he opts for this tricky sideline, and I believe he's played this quite a bit before, like in rapid events, and yeah, when he's playing for the win against a lower rated player. And Black's idea here is to kind of go for the King's Indian, but also try to get some other options along the way. So for instance, after knight c3, like I played in the game, Black has this additional option with e5, which is quite sharp. Or if White goes, let's say, knight f3 here, stopping e5, then after g6, knight c3, Black's idea here is not to play bishop g7 and just go for the King's Indian, but rather to play bishop f5, this line, which I believe Fabiano has played quite a bit before. So yeah, these lines are quite tricky, and I've looked at them from Black's point of view, because I was looking for, you know, something interesting to play, and I remember them being like really sharp and very dangerous in terms of if you play it against a well-prepared opponent and they know what to do, they might just like punish you right out of the opening. But for this game, of course, I was caught completely unprepared. Like, it's probably been over a year since I looked at it, and I looked at it from Black's point of view, so I never quite figured out what I'm gonna do with it from White's point of view. So I played knight c3, he went e5, and I knew that the critical move here was knight f3. But the line after e4 is quite sharp, and White has a couple options here, either knight g5 or knight d2. I think both are playable, and yeah, the position ends up being really messy. If you turn Stockfish on, it'll tell you that White is like having a big advantage, but over the board, I didn't want to just go into something that's like super unclear against, you know, probably maybe even the world's like greatest expert on one of these sidelines. So yeah, it just seemed like very dangerous, especially in a rapid game when you don't have time to figure stuff out. I just wanted to go for a structure that was more comfortable and more familiar. So I played e3, which looks super tepid and passive, but I actually think it makes perfect sense. I mean, if Black just goes for a King's Indian, for instance, like with g6, knight f3, bishop g7, White goes bishop e2. This is definitely not the most dangerous way to play against the King's Indian, but we are transposing to the e3 line, which actually has some value. I think it gives White, let's say, a simple position that you can play for 2 results. In fact, I believe Fabiano has played this way with White, like against the King's Indian and Grunfeld setups. Instead, after e3, he goes for knight c6, which is kind of provoking White to take space. In fact, very similar to the game from round 1. And I felt like, okay, of course I have to take the space if I'm still fighting for an advantage. And we end up getting King's Indian structure here because he goes g6. But the difference here is that White has spent 2 tempi playing e3 and then e4. So if I just transpose into mainline King's Indian, like bishop g7, I ended up playing h3, but if I went bishop e2, castles, we basically have a mainline position where White is a tempo down. And I thought about it, but I thought this is, I mean, it would be quite foolish. So I realized, okay, I shouldn't just go for that line and transpose to a position where I'm a tempo down. And I felt like playing h3 would be quite interesting. And now I was trying to figure out, like, from a theoretical point of view, because this isn't exactly transposing to the h3 system, because in the h3 line, Black's knight on e7 is typically on b8, and then Black plays like a5, knight a6, knight c5, and doesn't usually get this knight c6, knight e7. So to be honest, I really wasn't sure whether this extra tempo black can actually use, or if the knight is necessarily worse or better placed on e7. In any case, he goes castles, and I play bishop e3, and he goes knight h5, which I think is definitely a very critical move, because now he's just preparing f5 and knight f4. And actually already I was starting to feel uncomfortable, because if he's just playing for f5, then the knight on e7 is of course quite well placed. So I was thinking about something like g3, but yeah, after f5 I felt like white's not in time here, and not even getting the pieces out, because like f4 is coming. If I take, he can take with the knight or with the pawn, and yeah, just looked very, very risky. So I was already feeling kind of unhappy here, but I tried to figure out some way to reach something interesting and playable, and then I realized actually I could play this move g4. I mean, it looks very strange, I think, at first, because I'm just kind of allowing the knight into f4, and I never want to take this one and open up the diagonal. But I realized that I can just kind of play around the knight on f4. So I can leave my bishop on f1. It's kind of dominating the knight, so by, let's say, controlling all the squares that the knight is attacking. So the knight looks really nice, but isn't actually doing that much. And in the meantime, I can just castle and get my king over to b1, and it's not clear actually how black is going to do anything. The other point behind g4, of course, is to discourage black from playing f5. Because now if black plays f5, he has to allow me to open the g-file, and then I can play like a quick rook g1, and okay, this is always extremely double-edged. Not necessarily that white is better, but clearly white has a lot of play in this type of position. So actually, at this point, I was feeling much more comfortable than I was a few moves ago. And he quickly goes c6, which looks like a really logical move. And here I kind of noticed that I could take on c6 and just try to play against the d6 pawn. So typical idea, to take on c6, ask black how he's going to recapture, and then depending on the response, maybe play rook d1 or castles queenside and just target the pawn. And I have no idea what his intentions were, because at first I thought bc6 looks more critical, especially since I've indicated that I'm going to castle queenside. And I was thinking about going for this position because black can't hold the pawn, so it might simply just be good for white. But then I saw that he might play d5. And so immediately, it's set in that I'm playing like, one of the best players in the world. Of course, Fabiano is like a great Grunfeld player. I think he's played some King's Indian as well. And this kind of position just looked like a nightmare to go into. So yeah, psychologically, I wanted to keep the position under control, which wasn't necessarily the wrong decision, but had we gone for this, I mean, it could have really worked out quite well for white. Okay, so the danger here is, of course, if I just, I don't know, take a bunch of times on d5, or let's say we take with the pawn. I mean, this feels super risky, because maybe somewhere black can just go e4 and open up the bishop, and yeah, I mean, so many open lines against the king, the number of pawns just doesn't really matter here. But one move that Stockfish pointed out that I didn't realize in my calculations was that I could just play knight takes e5 here, which works because the knight on f4 is now hanging. And if I can grab this pawn and kind of get away with it, then the position actually just becomes extremely concrete. So it's no longer about, oh, there's too many open files against my king. I mean, if black is not surviving here, then white is just going to end up too much material ahead. And now, of course, I can play bishop d4 and try to neutralize the bishop, and then my king is not going to have that much trouble. So, I mean, I don't know exactly whether he would have gone for this, because he can also take with the knight on c6. Positionally, I think this one's a little bit worse, because it just leaves him with the d6 square as a d6 pawn as a big weakness, and the d5 square as a big weakness. And yeah, after something like castles, queen a5, let's say king b1, I think white has a pretty decent version of like a Marazzi bind type structure. Since black has blocked the diagonal, and I can play knight b5 soon, or knight d5, and I think white is kind of in control here, but I don't know if white is like slightly better, much better, or whatever. But definitely the king is not really in that much danger on the queen side. Black doesn't really have many open lines here. So yeah, to be honest, I just kind of chickened out. I mean, I saw dc6, bc6, castles d5, and got scared, and I felt like there's no reason to go into this. But hopefully in the future, if I see some kind of critical continuation, I can I'll try to just go for it next time. I mean, it's easier said than done, but yeah, it would have been interesting to see what would happen there. Okay, so I ended up castling, which actually, I mean, doesn't spoil anything, except okay, allows black to take on d5. He goes bishop d7. I play king b1, and yeah, I felt like white should be doing quite all right here. I think the king is very, very safe on b1 actually, because black's pieces are hard pressed to really reach it, and I can always fight for the c file with like rook c1. So to me, the position feels very safe. Like the knight on f4 is just kind of sitting there, not doing much. And in fact, I realized after a6 that I could just play knight e2 and trade this knight off, not for my bishop, but for my knight. And if black doesn't take, then I can either win a pawn or play bishop d4 and trade off the king's Indian bishop. So he takes on e2, bishop takes e2, and bishop b5. And yeah, so around here I felt like white should be fine, but I really wasn't thinking that white could be better here. And I'm not sure why. I mean, probably had something to do with playing an elite player, like just feeling generally pessimistic about the position. I don't think it's that dangerous to take on b5 and just play a3. I'm not exactly sure what black can do there, but I didn't really want to do it. I wanted to just keep the tension with the bishop on e2. And I ended up playing this move rook g1, which, yeah, is probably a little bit too slow. Not that it's a bad move, but I think white had some better options here. I mean, I played this move to just continue to discourage black from playing f5, but I should have realized that he simply had no intentions to play this move, because already if he plays f5, then I have knight g5 ideas, or I can take on f5 first and then play rook g1, and it's quite dangerous for black. Of course, I also have to watch out for f4, but yeah, I mean, there was no reason to really discourage this, because it would just lead to, I think, a really interesting fight. Instead, what I should have done was just play h4 and just get with my play, and just push the h pawn, play h5, try to double on the h file, or play bishop h6 somewhere, and just go for the direct attack. And actually, it looks quite nice for white. I really wish I had found this. For instance, if black plays like queen d7, I can go h5, just sacrificing the g4 pawn. Black can take, I go rook h4. The queen has to go back, and then we can just double on the h file. And yeah, I let Stockfish run in this position for a bit, and it got more and more optimistic from white's point of view, indicating that white's attack is really strong. And yeah, it seems like I'm ready to at some point just trade on b5, play bishop h6, or take on g6, and yeah, the open h file seems really, really useful. So yeah, I play rook g1, just, yeah, too slow. He goes queen d7, rook c1, and I can kind of feel like my mindset was that, I was just trying to keep the position under control. I really wasn't thinking about playing for the advantage, which is of course very, very wrong, because objectively white is kind of slightly better here with the space advantage, and since black doesn't have much counterplay yet, I think white's space advantage does have some value. So yeah, should have treated it more ambitiously. I think that's kind of the main lesson here. Okay, so he goes rook fc8. He's playing quickly, just like natural moves. He doesn't really care that he's not better yet. I think he was just trying to, make natural moves and even put some pressure on the clock. And then here I thought for a little bit, and I end up playing h4, which is of course the kind of the right plan, but I really chose the perfectly worst moment to play this move, because it turns out to be just a direct blunder, unfortunately. What I should have done instead was just trade rooks first. This would avoid the tactics that occur in the game. Black recaptures, and there's not a whole lot black can do on the c file just yet, so I can play h4 here. try to play h5 and get some play going on the king side. For instance, like bishop e2, queen e2, queen a4. I can go queen d3. Everything is covered. Black's pieces are still kind of passive, and I think white should be at least slightly better here. And yeah, this would be a pretty comfortable position. I don't think black can really get much. I can always kind of stabilize everything with knight d2 soon. So yeah, h4 ends up being a blunder because he takes on c1. And originally I just felt that I could just take with my king here. He'll throw in a check. I'll play king b1 back. And my king is perfectly safe. In fact, we're getting a very similar position to what we just looked at. So the reason h4 is a blunder is because I can no longer take with my rook, since this would drop the g4 pawn. And maybe can take on e2 first as well. And in this case, I don't think I would be getting much compensation here. And of course the queen can't take on c1 because the bishop on e2 is hanging. So I played king takes c1, still thinking everything. Actually, no, I think at this point I had already realized that I blundered. Yeah, basically, like, as soon as I played h4, I kind of realized what was going to happen. And of course he takes on e2, queen takes e2, and like simple move queen a4. And yeah, a2 is hanging, e4 is hanging, and there's simply no defense to this double attack. So I went into the tank here, using up like most of my time trying to figure out what to do, because it seemed like the position is about to become hopeless. And unfortunately, actually, there's just nothing here, because either black is winning the e4 pawn, and then also the d5 pawn, so winning 2 pawns, or black is going to take on a2 and then just have a pretty monstrous attack with rook c8. Yeah, basically either white loses everything or white gets mated. So I tried to fight on a little bit. I decided just to safeguard my king, king b1, king a1. He ends up taking on e4. He goes rook c8. He can take the d5 pawn at any moment, and it's clear that black now is just completely winning. He grabs the second pawn, plays queen c6, so that white doesn't have queen f3 ideas. And yeah, it's basically hopeless. Just like 2 pawns down, the pawns are very easily like moving d5, d4, and basically just white has zero compensation to speak of. So I kept fighting. I played h5, but he pretty much kept, total control. I mean, he converted basically about as cleanly as you could possibly imagine. Just started pushing. Okay, puts his queen on e6 because d4 was currently allowing bishop d4 and then queen e7, which is probably winning for black anyway, but of course there's no reason to give up a pawn. So queen e6, and then everything just kind of rolls very smoothly for him here. D3, queen e3, rook c2, and yeah, with my queenside collapsing, I decided this would probably be a good moment to resign. So yeah, I felt like actually it was a really interesting game. He got the drop on me in the opening, but then I managed to kind of wriggle out and find something quite playable. In fact, even reaching a position that was better for white. Of course, during the game, I wasn't really thinking about being better, and of course this led me to just kind of let's say not going for the most ambitious plan that I could have. Then h4 was kind of an unfortunate blunder, but okay, it's clear I don't think I had quite the right mindset for the position. But nevertheless, it was an awesome opportunity to play against such a strong player, and yeah, I could really feel it. Like, it's not that his moves necessarily were so amazing, but actually a lot of his moves were very accurate, and he played them extremely quickly, which just put a ton of pressure on me on the clock almost from the very beginning. So yeah, definitely one of the toughest opponents I've ever played, I have to say. Alright, in the next game I played against another local master, Eric Lee, who is pretty young but a really talented player. I had previously played Eric in the US Amateur team, which was a tournament just a few months ago, and this time we actually had the same color. So that previous game was a King's Indian, This time he goes for the King's Indian a second time, or I should say I played it. And I think in the previous game he played the H3 system. Here he goes for F3. And so finally we have our first traditional King's Indian from the correct move order. Okay, so I castled here, bishop E3. I played B6. I think this is a decent line to play against the Samish system. I think it's actually pretty simple for black. The idea is just to play C5 and then eventually kind of transpose into a Benoni type of position. So he goes queen D2, C5, knight GE2, and I played bishop A6, which is the theory here, just attacking the C4 pawn. And the idea is after B3 is to try and just put a lot of pressure on white center. So actually the theoretical move here is E6, which I definitely knew, but during the game I just got mixed up and I played knight C6 first, which I think is a little bit dubious. The idea usually is to play E6 first, then go knight C6, and then if white pushes D5, black can just immediately exchange on D5 and get this Benoni type position, and I think it's quite playable for black. But okay, I started with knight C6, he goes D5, knight E5, knight G3, E6, and we eventually reach actually a pretty comfortable position. I took on D5 here, and he played c takes D5. Actually, analyzing it afterwards, I think he really should have played ED5, which would just leave my bishop on A6 kind of misplaced. Not kind of, but really misplaced, and now white is kind of ready to push F4, F5, castles, bishop G5, and yeah, white gets pretty serious initiative here. So that would have been kind of the way to punish black. But he goes c takes D5, which allows me to trade off the bishop, and we reach this kind of hybrid King's Indian Benoni position, and I think this is a pretty good version for black. So I played A6, threatening to play B5. He goes A4, and I missed a chance here to play C4, which I really should have spotted because it's a pretty typical idea. And the point is I'm threatening knight D3 check, I'm threatening to take the pawn, and if B takes C4, knight C4, then I'm getting the dark squared bishop, and this is already looking really nice for black. Okay, instead I played B5, which I think is maybe the second best move in the position. It's a pawn sacrifice, but during the game I felt like it would be too dangerous for white to take this one. I thought he should just castle here and ignore it, but he does take on B5 and grabs on A8, queen takes A8, and knight takes B5. So, okay, here I started to think how I'm going to get compensation for the pawn. My experience in these positions told me that normally black gets a ton of play with this Benko style gambit, and that was correct, but I did end up misplaying this one, unfortunately. So what I should have done here was just play the move rook to B8, which is kind of a simple move, but I thought maybe I had something better. And if the knight goes back, then just take on B3, and black has won back the pawn and is now threatening knight C4 again, which is really annoying. And the problem for white is just kind of lacking a few tempi here to castle and consolidate the position. So I think black is getting a pretty serious initiative. If white takes on D6 here, then black has this idea to play queen A6. And this kind of traps the knight, because after knight C4, okay, we can take and check and win back the pawn. And black is still a pawn down, but white has a ton of dynamic issues here, like king F2 is already running into knight E4, I believe, takes, and then rook B2 winning the queen. And yeah, if white can't develop, then it's going to be really bad. So yeah, this move would have basically just granted black a pretty nice advantage. Instead, I played queen A1 check, which I thought was better, but I think this was a misjudgment. He goes knight C1, rook B8, knight takes D6, and I could play queen A6 here, but well, my idea was to take on B3. He castles, I go rook B2, and the point is that actually white's queen is lacking a good square because he doesn't have queen C3 in view of rook takes G2 check. So he has to play a move like queen d1, and now I finally play queen a6. So this was kind of the idea I was playing for, trying to first take the b3 pawn and then trap the knight. He takes on c5, black goes knight d7, and yeah, this is kind of the position I was playing for, since, okay, the bishop is defending the knight, but the bishop is under attack, and it's very hard for white to keep everything defended here. He goes bishop d4, hitting my rook, and rook b4. So my point is, I'm now still threatening the knight, I'm also threatening rook takes d4 and knight takes f3. And so white has to deal with both of these threats. He goes bishop c3, queen takes d6, bishop takes b4, queen b4, and finally we reach this position where black has 2 pieces for the rook, but white has these 2 extra pawns, and really double-edged position. I mean, I think with shorter time controls, I would normally favor the minor pieces over the rook, because you have more tactical chances, and especially knights are so tricky that they're hard to deal with in time trouble. But objectively, I felt like, okay, white should at least be fine here, because white is up some material, and as long as white can keep the center under control, then it shouldn't be too dangerous. But it's a very tough position to play, and we both started making lots and lots of mistakes. But alright, it's always fun to see this stuff after the fact. So king h1, knight c4, knight d3, and I'm just trying to keep the pieces active here. He's trying to keep everything under control. I went bishop h6, kind of provoking him to go f4 and to start extending. And then I really mess up here with knight f6, since he correctly spots this move d6. And now I can't take the pawn in view of e5. So other than knight f6, I should have played queen d4, and then I think chances are about equal, just kind of keeping everything under control for now. Okay, so we get knight f6, d6. Now the pawns, I realize, are just running because he's getting e5 in, and things are looking really dangerous for me. In fact, my bishop on h6 looks incredibly bad. But okay, I try to do my best. Queen d4. He pushes e5 and knight d5. So yeah, this allows him to get his pawn to d7. I was kind of counting on knight to e3. At this point, I think we're both down to less than 2-3 minutes with the 2-second increment. So yeah, things are definitely getting pretty heated. And he goes rook f3, which was an interesting move, threatening to take on e3 and then promote and win the knight. At the very minimum, he can also keep his pawn on d7 alive and play for a lot more. So I go knight f5. He pushes e6. And yeah, now things are just looking incredibly bad for black. I assumed I was just totally busted here, which I think is correct. If I take, queen takes e6 comes, and then he's going to have queen e8 check, and he's simply promoting. And I don't think I'll have any back rank tricks or anything like that. So I played king f8. This looked like the only move to keep things alive. And then he actually ends up messing up here and goes e takes f7, which after queen takes d7, amazingly, black kind of has everything under control. Correct was this idea to play knight c5, which I think white actually could have played on previous moves as well. Just supporting the pawns, and of course the knight cannot be taken because then white is promoting. And basically, I think white is preparing rook d3 here. Can always block queen a1 with rook d1, and then of course the pawn is finally going to queen. So that was a very clear win. Instead, he takes on f7, queen takes d7, knight c5, which looks really strong for white because he has knight e6 check. In case of queen f7, he can give this check, and he wins the knight on c4 and is just going to be up in exchange here. But actually, after queen b5, amazingly, black is holding this. So I actually was able to calculate this accurately, but after doing so, I end up messing up big time. So it was quite unfortunate for me. He goes rook b3, and I realized I can totally just get away with taking on c5. Allowing queen e8 check, king g7. I have the promotion square under control. And in case of queen g8 check, king f6, the bishop ends up covering the square, and black now has 3 pieces for the rook, and is actually, I think, doing quite well, because the king is going to be reasonably safe. I can block with my pieces, and actually if queen d8 check, I'll probably just take the pawn on f7, and okay, as soon as white loses the initiative, black is going to be able to take over and probably win the game. So I think he did have a draw with rook to b8, which threatens to mate with f8 queen. And then black is the one who actually has to force a draw with knight g3 check, takes, and queen h5, queen d1, and perpetual. But okay, we were so down on time, you know. He ends up playing f8 equals queen. I take, rook b7 check, and I'm actually out of the woods here. I got all his pawns off the board, and now I have 3 pieces for the rook, and I thought it should be winning, and indeed it is winning, but yeah, somehow I just wasn't able to calculate anything anymore. I think, yeah, I was just not in the right mindset or something, because my brain really like kind of shut off, and I stopped calculating basically. So for one, I play this move king g8, just allowing queen e6 check, and I saw queen e6 check was coming. I just didn't realize that king h8 was an option in the first place. I think I probably just forgot that my bishop is defending my queen, and that I'm fine here. For some reason I thought maybe I have to play king f6, and this looked a little bit too dangerous, so I didn't want to go for this. So I ended up going king g8, thinking, okay, I have to give up a piece, but at least my king will be safe. But then it gets even weirder. So after queen e6 check, king h8, queen takes c4, it turns out black has this move knight d6. Kind of an obvious move, but the point is that if white gives a check on the diagonal, black can play bishop to g7 and responds with tempo, and is actually going to be winning the rook. And so black is going to be piece up and presumably should be winning. But yeah, I didn't even realize that knight d6 was possible. I think at this point I was just focused on playing quickly, and yeah, not really adjusting to the new situation. I played bishop g7, which is just too slow. He goes queen c7, now he's turning rook to b8. So I'm forced to play queen f6. Black is still fine here, but not really better. He goes queen b8 check, bishop f8, and queen e5. So he correctly trades off the queens and really reduces all risk of losing to basically 0. So I take on e5, take, and here I make my last blunder with bishop e7. So painful. And then he goes g4, and yeah, basically I could resign here. I tried to play on a few moves, but his technique was good enough with the rook versus the knight, and yeah, basically just had no chances in this one, and he ended up winning. So yeah, such a messy game, and then it ends with like a really tragic blunder. Had I played like h5 here, the position it would still be very, very close to equal, very drawish. I mean, I think a draw is an extremely likely result. Black can then go king g8, bishop e7, and start coming in, and because of how few pawns there are on the board, I think neither side can really hope for much here. So that was kind of an unfortunate one, like first losing a lot of winning chances, and then missing out on a pretty simple draw, but what can you do? That's rapid chess for you. So yeah, at this point I was on 1 out of 3, and I was definitely hoping to come back and put up a plus score in the tournament. And okay, I felt like regardless of what happens, it's still just like an awesome experience to play against so many strong players. And yeah, I don't get to play rapid very often, so it definitely is a pretty fun experience. So that loss was a bit disappointing. I felt like at some point I just basically lost my concentration, and yeah, just stopped calculating, and really got punished badly for it. But of course the tournament wasn't over. There are 2 more rounds to go. In round 4 I was paired against National Master Jordi Montrenaud, who I actually played in the Bay Area International earlier this year. And in that game, he had white, and he actually beat me in a really sharp King's Indian. This time I had white, and I played d4. He goes g6, c4, bishop g7, knight c3, and b6. So the double fianchetto. I definitely wasn't prepared for this, but yeah, it's not my first time playing against the hippopotamus, so I had some idea of what to do here. I basically just wanted to grab some space, put my pieces in the center, and stay flexible. I knew objectively, okay, anything that white does here should be better, but you still actually have to come up with a good plan in the middle game and play well in order to crack this opening. So he goes full hippo, d6, queen d2, and queen d7. This move definitely caught me by surprise, but I figured, okay, his idea is to play knight to c6, and then, yeah, maybe even castle queenside, since he is kind of developed there. I ended up going h4. I don't think this is a great move, but it is a typical idea just to try to provoke a weakness and ask black whether he's going to allow us to play h5 or not. He decided to go h5. I played knight h3, and just kind of highlighting the drawbacks of having h4, h5 in the position is that now I can put my knight on g5, and the knight would be well placed there. Not sure if this was exactly the best way to play, because I think he does end up reaching a reasonable position, but well, it's rapid chess, so you basically have to come up with an idea and go for it. Okay, he goes knight c6, I play bishop c2. I think this was a nice move, defending the d4 pawn and threatening to play bishop a4. He castles, bishop a4, I'm threatening d5, so he has to go queen e7, and I put my knight on g5. And then he goes knight a5, hitting the c4 pawn. And I didn't want to play b3 here because I felt like that would be leaving my bishop in kind of an awkward spot. So I decided to play queen d3, which I think is okay. And then he really surprised me here with this move f6. I thought this was just, I mean, very ugly looking for his position because it's weakening a lot of squares. And I was expecting black to go d5. Which, okay, is still better for white, but I think white has to find some concrete lines here, and definitely would not be that easy in a game. But from black's point of view, the position is really dynamic, and black is fighting for a lot of light squares in the center. So I was definitely happy to see f6. I felt like I could just go knight h3 and knight f4 here, and I think this would be good for white. But I found this idea to play b4, which ends up working out, but maybe objectively not the best move. So my point is I'm counterattacking the knight, so of course if fg5, I can think about bishop takes g5, or I can just take on a5 immediately. And I'm not really worried about the pawns here, it's more about just trying to open up lines against black's king. So I want to take on b6, maybe play rook b1, and try to go for this queenside attack. I thought actually during the game maybe knight c4 was the best try, and I think it is. I felt like, okay, at least I'm opening up the c file and I'll definitely have play here. But black can either take on g5 or play this move d5, and things are pretty sharp. I think with best play, white should still be better here, but black is going to win back the piece eventually on g5, and yeah, things will be very, very hectic. But instead black played knight c6, which is definitely a serious mistake, because now white can just get a huge advantage by force, basically. So I found bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6, and I could play d5 here, but I felt like knight takes e6 is kind of a more forcing way to do it. Now black is kind of obliged to take the knight. I go d5, and I win back the piece, and importantly, I'm taking his very, very good light squared bishop, which is defending the king, and yeah, without this bishop, black's light squares end up being really weak. And finally, I castle. I think it is actually one of my best moves in the game, because sometimes it's very satisfying when you play with the king in the center for a while, and then you find the right moment to get your rook in, and now white's position, I think, is really excellent. So he goes knight h6, knight d5, queen d7, b5, My idea here was to threaten to play knight b4 and queen d5, and then go for the mating attack, or knight c6 and queen a3. But actually c5 was a lot stronger, just like opening up the queen towards the a6 square, and if king b7, white has this trick with c6 check, which is really nice, followed by rook c1 and taking on c7. But okay, b5, he went f5, hitting the rook, and at this point I actually thought it was an interesting idea just to take on h6. So my idea was, if he simply recaptures this one, then his rook will be misplaced. If he takes with the bishop, then my rook on a1 is no longer hanging. And okay, if he takes this way, I'll just go like rook a d1 or rook a e1, and I felt like my knight on d5 is a really strong piece, and I still have this this plan with knight b4, queen d5. And if black takes on a1, my idea was to retreat with bishop g5, and then black's bishop is hanging, and I'm threatening not only the rook, but also potentially like knight e7 check, and then queen d5 and knight c6. Some dangerous ideas, or at the very minimum, just winning back the exchange, which with a nice position. But he ended up playing f takes e4 here, which is kind of a blunder, because I just grabbed this knight on h6, he takes this pawn, and then I played queen a3, threatening to take on a7, and then just made him on a8. So now he's not really in time to defend against this threat, and of course regain his material. So yeah, this was just kind of a game-ending blunder. He tried a5, but this simply allows me to take on g7, queen g7, and I'm just left with an extra piece. So I didn't have too many issues converting this one. When you when you have like a solid knight on d5, it's usually not too bad. And that put me back on an even score with 2 out of 4, which definitely put me in a good mood before the final round. So in the final round, I played Ina Agrest, who's another master, and I was given a double white. So again, I played d4. And she went for the pure King's Indian, so the second traditional King's Indian, but of course the fifth King's Indian type of position. So I decided to go for the h3 line, similar to what I did against Fabiano, but of course a different move order. She castled and bishop e3. This is a pretty trendy line nowadays, to start with bishop e3 rather than knight f3, as is more typically seen, with the point of often developing the knight to e2 and g3, where it can sometimes be better placed, especially with a pawn on g4. So black goes for e5. I play d5 and knight e8. Pretty typical idea. Preparing f5. I went g4, f5, and I think this is quite dubious, but in a rapid game it's definitely playable, and I wasn't exactly sure what to do here, but I took on f5, and I took the second time, which is typically correct in these types of positions, freeing up the e4 square. And then after bishop takes f5, I decided to play knight f3 here, which to me looked logical to then go for like knight g5 and maybe knight e4. But after checking this after the game, I realized that knight e2 is actually just a lot stronger. Trying to play knight g3 with tempo, and then controlling the e4 square this way. So this is the correct way to play the position. It's logical because, again, this is exactly why white saved on knight f3 and started with bishop e3 to have this extra option. I didn't quite realize that during the game, but okay, after knight f3 I still felt like I'm getting a decent position. So black played queen f6, rook g1, king h8. I think the game progressed pretty typically here. I tried to fight for the e4 square. I thought maybe black should just play e4 and just give the pawn, but try to open some diagonals. I really wasn't sure exactly how I would approach this position. Maybe queen d2, maybe taking on e4. But to me this looked like kind of the critical way to play. Objectively, white is probably better, but it's always hard to figure this stuff out over the board. Instead, after knight d7, knight e4, I felt like, okay, now I have the e4 square, and I felt like I'm under control. I have the position under control here. So queen f7, bishop d3, knight c5, and this allows me to take on c5, and black structure kind of gets worse. I could play bishop e4 here. I decided just to trade the bishops off, and I wasn't really considering to grab this pawn on c5. Stockfish thinks it's totally playable, but to me it didn't really feel like in the spirit of the position to go pawn hunting. Usually when white is playing this kind of stuff, the idea is just to control the e4 square and just play technical chess. So I went for queen g4, kind of offering a queen trade. If queen c2, I can play queen e2 and kind of insist. Black took on g4, rook takes g4, b6. And yeah, I feel like this endgame would be very pleasant for white because I have this e4 square. In the long run, I'll always have the better bishop. And yeah, a lot of, I think, small advantages here for white. So knight e4, knight d6, knight g5. I definitely don't think I play this in the most accurate way, but yeah, you know, this was the last round and everyone was tired, so I think we were both playing kind of quickly to more or less get the game over with. And so I came up with a simple plan, put the knight on e6. I think black should have maybe just played rook f7 here, just defending the pawn this way. And then I would continue maybe b3 or king e2, and just try to make slow progress. Instead, she played rook g8, which allows me to... well, I first played b3, but the idea was to eventually take on c7. Rook takes g4 was played, hg4, e4, and I decided to castle in this moment. Okay, now I'm saving the rook, the c4 pawn is defended, and I felt pretty good here. Like my rook can easily activate with rook h1, I can play g5 at some point. And yeah, the c7 pawn is a constant weakness, and I have like bishop f4 always, and it's very annoying for black. So black played rook g8. I decided to just take on c7 and give up the g4 pawn. Not sure if this was the right choice. I think g5 would have been probably better, but okay. At this point, I was just sticking to very simple ideas. I took the pawn. Now I wanted to break the blockade of the knight on d6. So I went back with knight e6 and threatening bishop f4. Black went bishop e5, rook h1, and after knight f5, I'm able to play rook h5, which is a nice idea because I'm forcing a trade. And after the trade of pieces, white's d-pawn is going to be really, really strong. So black played knight takes e3, rook takes e5, and unfortunately for black, the knight simply can't get back to defend the pawn. So this is basically just kind of hopeless already. Rook g1 was played, king d2, knight g4, rook f5, defending the f-pawn, threatening mate, and keeping the knight kind of cut off from being able to stop the pawn. So black starts looking for counterplay, but it's really not enough. The rook and knight against a very open king, they have a hard time coordinating. Yeah, black doesn't end up getting enough play. So finally, black plays h6 in order to avoid the mate with rook f8. I push d6, knight takes e3, rook f8 check, king h7, and just d7. Now I'm controlling the queening square so many times, I felt like, okay, my pawn is going to promote for sure. And this is a common pattern, but it doesn't really give enough counterplay for black because white's king kind of has enough room to wiggle out. Of course, if I was in the corner, then this would be very dangerous, but since we have rook c2 check, king b1, white is basically just totally winning here. So black tried to give a couple more checks, but eventually the king was able to just walk its way up out of checks, and yeah, that was basically it. I promoted the pawn, and the game was over. So yeah, it felt good to win the last two after losing two in a row. Of course, I wish I had taken more chances in some of the games that I lost, but overall I feel like I played a decent day of chess in the Rapid tournament. It was once again a really great experience. The Mechanics Chess Club is a really lovely place to play. It has a lot of history, and yeah, I always like it when they do strong events there. And apparently it was like the strongest event the strongest rapid event ever held in San Francisco, according to some people. I don't know how true that is, but if that's the case, then that's quite an achievement. All right, guys, thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.